Our reading from Exodus this morning includes one of the most important revelations from the whole of Scripture, where Moses hears the voice of God, asks for God's name, and the voice says, "I am who I am." Or in other translations, "I will be who I will be. Tell the people I am has sent you." God as being, God and the ground of all being. It's a very important idea, and I've preached about this a couple times before. The text from one of those sermons is even on our website. It's the first one actually encountered on the website. And that's got good sides and bad sides to it, because usually I try to make my sermons fairly interesting and something people can think about, but I try to make them relatively forgettable so that I can say them again after a few years and nobody really remembers. But if it's right there in the first one on the website, you can't really do that. God will be what God will be, and I refer you to that. It's stjamesmonterey.org if you want the full text. So today I decided to change the focus a little bit to dim sort of the overpowering light that shines on and from God. Dimming the light of God is what some people have accused me of doing more often than not, but to dim that in order to see the surround, in order to see the context of this revelation, to look at Moses receiving the revelation. What do we learn from that about how we might receive that revelation and come to understand God as the great I am, the God as being, which is not an easy concept. It doesn't really fit with our usual stereotype vision of God as a supreme being, a being within the universe. Really, it's God as underlying all that. To experience that, Moses had to turn aside. Actually, first he had to run away, and then he had to turn aside, because prior to the place where our lesson begins, there's a whole story about Moses that we know from reading Exodus and from movies about it. Moses was a priest, born to a priestly family, was a baby in Egypt who was given up for adoption and adopted into Pharaoh's household, was adopted by Pharaoh's sister and became Pharaoh's nephew. But when our lesson opens, he's on the lam. He is wanted for murder in Egypt, and he's hiding out in Midian. He worked for the priest there and married the priest's daughter, had a son. So basically, he was a criminal refugee trying to start a new life. But then he saw the burning bush, a bush that was burning but was not burned up. "I will turn aside to see this great sight," he says. And it was only then, an unplanned event, certainly in his life a couple years earlier, when he encountered God. He saw God. He heard the voice. He turned aside, and God said, "Moses, Moses." Only with that diversion from what had been his normal life? Did God feel he was ready for that revelation and the call that follows the revelation? Most of us don't get that far. Most of us don't ever get in as much trouble as Moses thought he was in. Most of us don't have to run for our lives. We're not in such legal jeopardy that will throw away a secure upper-class life and go herd sheep, start over. Usually if people are in the privileged class, not even as exalted maybe as Pharaoh's adopted nephew, but well-fed and well-housed and with responsible work. Usually people like that, we let other people do our dirty work for us, fight our battles, clean our messes up. Or else we learn how to manipulate the system and get away with things that other people don't get away with. Or if we're nervous or anxious, very often we'll be careful and not do things that'll get us in trouble because we've got too much to lose. That reminds me of when Jesus says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to get into heaven, because if things are going really well, you don't really turn aside. You don't look for other answers. You're busy. You're feeling responsible, and things are going well. You're caring for your family. Your friends are able to depend on you, and you don't think to find the bush that's burning. Moses had to. It had gotten that bad. In addiction recovery, they talk about hitting bottom. That for someone who's truly addicted to seek help and be willing to change their life in the radical ways that are called for in addiction, they need to, it said, suffer enough that they really have no other choice than to get better. Now, addiction is dangerous enough that sometimes the bottom is someplace you can't come back from. So in the work of those who try to help with recovery, there's talk about raising the bottom. You do certain things in counseling and in not enabling the addict so that they will experience the consequences of their addiction and change direction. In evangelical Christian preaching, this is called convicting of sin. The preacher first has to show how the listener is lost, or at least in danger of being lost, so that they'll grab onto the lifesaver that the preacher is offering. Realizing you're lost can be the first step in being found. It's not so spiritually great when everything's going well. The deadliest cancers are the ones that don't hurt. So we need to take advantage of the crises in our life when they occur. When our comfortable, easy way of life goes off the rails, or when it's severely challenged. When we have a spiritual emergency, that's the time when you can have a spiritual emergence. So that the worst things that happen to you may be central to the way that God is calling you. At least it's worthwhile to look at them like that. Sometimes we just react, like Moses, we run away. But you can depend on God. God will use every part of your life. And even when you run away, God will be there at the right time and keep calling. There's also something else that occurred to me in looking at this with Moses. that I don't think the Bible tells us much about, and that has to do with his inner uncertainty. And an inner uncertainty that, along with some external crisis, may be important in our encountering God in being. When he was back in Egypt, did he really feel like he belonged to Pharaoh's inner circle? I mean, he was nursed by his biological mother. He had some knowledge, I think, of a connection to the Hebrews. Otherwise, he wouldn't have killed an Egyptian who was mistreating a Hebrew. But why that reaction? What's going on? When God calls him eventually to return to Egypt, his first question is, who am I? And that might have been a question that he really had wrestled with most of his life. He wasn't comfortable in his own skin. He wasn't comfortable in his own advanced and high position in life. He sensed something being needed. So before we decide what we believe about God, we may need to figure out what it is that we believe about ourselves. In escaping Egypt, Moses was trying to escape himself in a way, himself as murderer, as fallen hero or something. But he may also have been trying to find himself and was drawn to that oasis of Midian because there was something more that was needed. He's noticed that he's not even fully content then when he's got a family, he's got a wife, he's got a job, but he's found safe refuge. And even though the priest's son-in-law was probably less well off, I'm sure, than Pharaoh's nephew, he was secure. Nobody was out to arrest him. But he senses that there's something more than this security. He sees that flame. He sees the light. He turns aside. He turns aside to go to some place, not to flee from it this time. When he ran from Egypt, which was a necessary step on this road, he was compelled. When he turns aside from tending the sheep, he chooses where to go. He chooses to explore the unknown, to open up to something that doesn't make sense in his workaday environment, just like that murder didn't make sense in his privileged position in Egypt. And it's then that he's ready for his encounter with God. And he approaches the bush, and he hears the voice, and he receives the call. But he's not sure he is up to it. So that first question, as I said, isn't about the bush. It's not about God. It's about himself. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? He's thinking, I'm a murderer. I'm not very experienced shepherd. God's answer to that question, who am I, is I will be with you. That's what God tells him he is, who God tells him he is. He answered, I will be with you. There's nothing about Moses that qualifies him for this work. God doesn't say, oh, well, you look like Charlton Heston, so it'd be great. In fact, there's defects he has. He has a lisp, he can't speak right. His call has to do with the way that he can make himself available for God to work through him. Not harnessing some great talent that he has. And that's true for all of us as well, I think. The Garden of Eden story says that one of the effects of the coming of human consciousness is a sense of separation. distance from God, from others. They knew they were naked and they were ashamed. When we eat of the fruit from that tree of knowledge of good and evil, in a way we step out of the picture in order to gain perspective for judgment, which is helpful in survival. But by stepping back, we all of a sudden become isolated individuals. In paradise, there's not isolation. You're connected to everything that's there. You're not self-aware, really. But as isolated individuals, God is not with us in the same way as before. There's a barrier. And our culture, after thousands of years from that encounter with Moses, has actually made a virtue of the disability of isolation rather than working to overcome it very much. People, of course, acting in groups can be more dangerous than people acting as individuals. We often feel that sense of individualism, individuality to be akin to freedom. But spiritually, individuality and isolation is deadly. God is the creator of wholeness, is in wholeness. Creator of everything, in everything, seen and unseen. And truth out of context isn't true anymore. And you, as an isolated individual, really aren't you. You're not the you that God created or the you that God is calling. Now, God was with Moses back in Egypt. Moses didn't know it. He was with him in the bulrushes. He was with him in the palace. And God was with Moses when he was out taking care of his father-in-law's sheep. But seeing the flame, hearing the voice, made a difference. It grounded him in being, the ground of being, and sent him on his way to bring a freedom to the people that transcended any freedom that we can have as isolated individuals. And that's true for us as well. Our lives are lived in relationship. In fact, in some ways, our lives simply are all our relationship. Each of us in some way, I'm sure, has a unique and special purpose. But our ultimate purpose is something we share. Our individual gifts and purpose and actions are always in a context that involves others and comes from God. So that our connection to being, talked about in this lesson, is central. I don't know what God has in store for the world. I don't know what God has in store for the church or for me, for that matter. But there's a flame that burns that hasn't gone out. Even in the spiritual vacuum of the 21st century. And I know that you see that flame too. I don't think you'd be here if you didn't see it. If you weren't curious about it. If you didn't know that something's going on that doesn't fit with this other way. And you know also that there are still slaves where we came from. And there's slaves in the palaces and there's slaves in the mud pits. And that we have a responsibility to the world to share whatever insight we get because we're the ones that see the flame. Once we've seen that flame, once we've heard that voice of wholeness, the voice of being calling us to the fullness of creation, we no longer can just rest secured in our palace or with the sheep. God is being, this lesson says. And we are with God. What will be, will be. Thanks be to God.